the Slayer story isn't over. Not on screen, not in the comics, and definitely not in the minds of fans. With new Sunnydale's pilot in production, there is no better time to delve further into the Slayer as a concept. It's been a fascinating journey so far. In the first Slayer lore video, we took a broad look at the Slayer mythos, how the line works, their powers and the Watchers Council's role. In the second, we went deeper, exploring how Slayers, or potential Slayers, are found before activation, why they're unpaid, and why the first evil might have chosen Season 7 to strike. And now we're here, part 3 in this little Slayer lore trilogy. This one's a bit more eclectic. We're still covering more common fan theories on the Slayer concepts and storylines, but we're also branching out into more abstract topics, covering things like real-world historical Slayers, or whether other vampire hunters in fiction could coexist in the Buffyverse. But before we get into the main topics, there's a quick couple of things I want to disclaim. Firstly, as is expected, we're exploring things across the show and the comics, so be cautious if you're sensitive to spoilers. Secondly, I want to thank everyone that engaged with my last video, because one of my favourite things about posting these videos is the brilliant fan insight that pours in afterwards. As a new channel, it's exciting to hear directly from fellow Buffy fans and also gain different perspectives. And in my last video, there were fantastic theories, counterpoints, clarifications, and a few absolute gems I wish I'd thought of myself. So after diving into today's main topics, I will be sharing some highlights from some of the most intriguing theories from the last video's comments section. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get on with today's topics, more Slayer lore fan theories and debates from throughout the years. Let's get started. What demon was used to create the Slayer? For all the dense mythology in the Buffyverse, there are still many questions and ideas left unexplored. One piece of Slayer lore that has been questioned in Reddit threads surrounds the exact nature of the demon the Shadowmen used to merge with the first Slayer, Sinea. The show established that they chained her to the earth, unleashed a demon essence made up of the heart, soul and spirit of a demon, and forced it inside her. This gave her strength, speed, resilience, prophetic dreams, and stripped away enough of her humanity to make her the unyielding, almost feral figure we first see in Restless. But what was that demon? The series never names it, and the fandom has been debating it ever since. According to the Buffyverse wiki, it's straightforwardly referred to as the Shadow Demon, and it's just that, a one-off, conjured for the purpose entity, never meant to appear elsewhere in the canon, a kind of bespoke horror tailored to mesh with a human soul. This interpretation sees the lack of details not as oversight but as a conscious choice. Reading fan theories online, some run with the idea that the demon was related to the progenitors of vampires themselves. The reasoning is simple. Slayers and vampires share certain physical traits, superhuman strength, rapid healing, heightened senses, and both lines originate with humans forcibly infused with demonic power. In this view, the Shadowmen simply borrowed a page from the same infernal playbook, using a cousin species of the one that birthed the first vampire. On the opposite end of the spectrum, some fans speculate the demon was far older and far more significant, perhaps even one of the old ones from the Primordium age. That ties it into deeper Buffyverse lore, where pure demons once roamed the earth before retreating to the deeper well, which in the lore is essentially an ancient burial ground running all the way through the earth. In this telling, the Slayer's power is a sliver of that primordial being. However, there is a sticking point with this theory. Commenters have argued that draining an old one's essence is no small feat. Even powerful shamans would struggle. Which leaves two options. Either the Shadowmen were staggeringly powerful, or the demon they bound wasn't a true old one, but a lesser, though still ancient, species. Then there's the more left field suggestion that the demon was connected to the first evil. The theory hinges on the black, incorporeal form it takes when we see it in Get It Done, which mirrors the first's own non-corporeal nature. If so, that could explain certain narrative coincidences, like why the first moves so aggressively against the Slayer line after Buffy's resurrection. If part of its essence has been bound into every Slayer for millennia, then destabilizing or eradicating the line might be a way of reclaiming lost power. There's also the dilution theory. From my research, this is actually considered canon. In the beginning, Sinea was practically part demon, but as the Slayer essence passed from one human to another over centuries, the demonic element became more symbolic than literal. By Buffy's day, what remained was a mystical charge, potent, yes, but far removed from the raw monstrosity of their first infusion. If you buy into this, it further explains why the Shadow Men in Get It Done offered Buffy the ritual like they did with Sinea. Her demon side was now so faint, they thought they could top it up, possibly and likely at the expense of burning her humanity away. Other interpretations from fans get more speculative, and occasionally more benevolent. One commenter proposed that the Shadow Demon might not have been evil at all. In their headcanon, it was a non-corporeal being already opposed to vampire kind, perhaps even working with the Shadow Men voluntarily. And finally, there's the general demonic essence camp. They argue it's a mistake to think in terms of species. The Shadow Men may not have bound Sinea to a specific demon at all, but rather tapped into a raw, universal demonic energy. This idea dovetails with the way the show treats magic as an impersonal force that can be channeled for good or evil depending on the wielder. In this model, the Shadow Demon is just shorthand for that force made manifest. What's clear is the ambiguity works in the show's favour. The writers gave the Slayer mythos a core mystery, one that feels older than the Council, older than the Watcher's diaries, and tantalisingly beyond verification. It's the kind of loose thread that keeps the lore alive in discussions decades later. Why does Slayer's strength seem inconsistent? Superhuman strength, that's one of the Slayer's most iconic traits. Right up there with prophetic dreams, quick-fire reflexes, and a depressingly short lifespan. But ask many Buffy fans and they'll tell you, Slayer strength doesn't always show up when you expect it to. In some episodes, Buffy can break locks with ease and leap rooftops in a single bound, literally. She's strong enough to toss full-grown demons across crypts or bend steel bars like they're made of paper. In Once More with Feeling, she kicks down the bronze's doors without breaking a sweat. But then, bizarrely, you'll see her struggle against a locked door or need backup from Xander to hold off a vampire horde. Some fans, and I agree with them, chalk this up to TV logic, writer differences, budget cuts, and yes, the ever malleable laws of plot convenience. But dig a little deeper and you'll find theories that make the inconsistency part of the Slayer's character design. The most compelling fan consensus? Buffy holds back. She's constantly suppressing her power around humans because she knows one wrong punch could kill someone. Buffy's surrounded by fragile humans, and she knows it. It's why a regular cop can restrain her in becoming part 2, for example. However, the one theory I see the most and agree with is that it's psychological. Several Reddit users point out that Buffy's power seems tied to her emotional state. When she's focused, supported, or filled with righteous anger, she's unstoppable. but when grief or self-doubt creeps in, the punches don't land as hard. Think the body in the beginning stages of grief at her mother's death. A basic vampire seems to be more work for her than usual. Or the freshman when Sunday wipes the floor with her while she's emotionally off balance. As one user put it, depressed Buffy forgets how to fight. Then there's the theory that Slayer strength isn't static. It grows with age and resolve. Much like how vampires become more dangerous over time, Slayers seem to deepen their connection to that ancient demonic essence the longer they survive. In this reading, Buffy's not just stronger in Season 7 than in Season 1 because of better training, she's evolving. This, of course, is even taken to unprecedented heights in the comics, which sees her become godlike. However, the series was never built for strict power scaling. It's part comedy, part teen drama, part supernatural horror. And in that cocktail, metaphors matter. As I said in my previous video, the lore and world building were correctly less priority for the writers than the emotional arcs, the storytelling and characterization. So from a lore perspective, we can only infer that Slayer strength is variable and it reflects mindset. In the case of Buffy, her power is real, but so are her insecurities, and that's what keeps her human. From the show, we learn the brutal truth. Most Slayers don't see their 18th birthday, and those who do are often finished off by the Council's own cruel test, the cruciamentum. So when comparing the various Slayers that we see in the series or hear about across the extended lore, one question has repeatedly been asked in the Buffy fandom. Who is the longest surviving Slayer? One name always comes up in these conversations, Nikki Wood. In the lore, and subsequently among fans, she has iconic status. By the time we meet her in Fool for Love, she's facing her final moments fighting with Spike on that New York subway train. But later in Season 7, we learn why she is an iconic Slayer. Not only did she defy the typical death statistics with her tenure, but she also had a child. Robin, later introduced as Principal Wood, was around 4 years old when his mother died in 1977. According to the lore, she was around 15 when she was activated, similar to Buffy, and was the active Slayer for 7 years. In fact, as we learn in the Tales of the Slayer Volume 4, her story is titled It's All About the Mission, as well as in the comics, Nikki faces her cruciamentum whilst pregnant. Naturally, there are various differences between the short story and the canonical comic. However, a fair majority of the beats remain. Her watcher, Bernard Crowley, is appalled that she must face their cruel test whilst carrying a child, and the Watchers Council do not stop it, which says a lot about the institution. To give a glimpse into the panic she faced when realising the situation, here's a brief snippet from the Tales of the Slayer short story, at the point Bernard has caught up with her inside the maze within the dark, old abandoned building they used for the test. At this point, the vampire Papa Doc is on the hunt for her, as she is completely powerless. However, her friend Jonah, who followed her, and her watcher Bernard have also entered the field of play. "What is going down?" she demanded quietly, and he told her as quickly and quietly as he could. Sick with shame, he explained the cruciamentum and revealed that he had been drugging her. "Damn you!" Tears dripped down her cheeks. "How could you do this to me?" "I had to," he said. Aye, but she covered her ears and shook her head, as if she couldn't stand to hear his voice. She tore off her hat and flung it to the floor, covering her mouth with both hands to stifle her sobs. "Oh, Slayer," a deep, gravelly voice rang out in a heavy French accent. It was Papa Doc. "I'm coming for you, ma petite." "You don't know what you've done," Nikki murmured, protectively cupping her belly. "You don't know." Bernard gazed at her levelly and whispered back, "I do know, Nikki. You're going to have a baby." Her lips parted. "And you still did this?" "I didn't know until a few days ago, and I had no choice but to continue with the preparations. The council..." "This is a rite of passage, Nicky." She flung herself at him and began to pound on his chest, but in her weakened state, Bernard could easily fend her off. "You bastard! You traitor!" "Slayer!" Papa Doc called. "Stop it, right now," Nicky hissed at her watcher. "I'm not playing." "You have to," Bernard told her. "There's no other way." He held out his hands to Nicky. "Do you think I would have gone through with this if I had a choice?" "There's always a choice," she snarled through her teeth like a vampire herself. "If the stakes had been high enough, you would have refused. I'm not letting that monster get my baby." She survives barely, and Crowley steps in to support her, offering a life of hiding in South America and Mexico to raise her child. However, she couldn't resist her calling and returned to New York to take up her duty as the Slayer. Her place in the Slayer canon is legendary. She was resilient in ways the council couldn't comprehend, again like Buffy. In Nicky's case, she, for 4 years, managed both motherhood and slayerhood until her death. Which other slayers are in the conversation for longest run? Buffy, of course, although she certainly complicates the picture. She dies twice, which muddies the waters. On a technical level, she's not the active slayer for the period between Prophecy Girl and Bargaining. If you're going by uninterrupted Slayer tenure prior to the comics, Nicky probably wins. But Buffy doesn't just stop being the Slayer when someone else is called, she keeps fighting. The comic timelines and later seasons further showcase her as an anomaly, a Slayer who survives into her 20s, then her 30s, and if we take the later New Sunnydale series into account, even her 40s. From the Slayer timeline and lore perspective, that's unprecedented. Then there's Faith. Faith is still alive as of season 12 of the comics, which puts her firmly into contention. But as many fans have pointed out, Faith's longevity is partly circumstantial. A coma, a prison sentence, and long stretches on the sidelines meant she wasn't in the field full time, unlike Buffy, who spent her teens and 20s punching gods, cyborg demons, and primordial evil. Faith spent years either incapacitated or incarcerated. It doesn't diminish her survival, but it does reframe it slightly and removes some of the shine. Some fans reach further back. The Tales of the Slayer anthologies also give us glimpses of Slayers who beat the odds. In fact, one Slayer really is the answer to the original question. Thessaloniki, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. An ancient Greek Slayer was called at 12 and survived until 29. That's 17 years. Extraordinary by any measure. She was a slave all her life and nearly died when she was 19 after being bitten. Miraculously, she survived and eventually perished a decade later when defending her home city of Athens in the war against Persia in 490 BCE. So where does that leave us? There is an obvious answer and some clear runners-up. If you're counting purely canonical sources and raw years in the field, then Nicky Wood is one of the runners-up, a full 7 years, balancing motherhood and the Slayer's burden until Spike ended it. If you're including non-canonical sources, then Tessely pips Nicky for her 17 years undefeated. However, if you're counting accomplishments, resilience and sheer refusal to stay dead, Buffy Summers is unmatched. Faith and a handful of others may come close to longest surviving, but Buffy breaks the record completely. However, the fact she is an extreme outlier illustrates that the odds were always stacked against the Slayer. Ultimately, their line wasn't built for longevity. How powerful is the blood of the Slayer? Few pieces of Buffy lore generate as much speculation as the question of Slayer blood. Over the years, fans have debated whether it's just another vampire boasting point or something generally world-altering. The truth, as usual in the Buffyverse, is murky, and that makes it ripe for theories. On their surface, the show gives us some striking examples of Slayer blood as a magical catalyst. In Prophecy Girl, the Master uses Buffy's blood to break free from his mystical prison, crying out, "Oh God, the power." Her Slayer blood is a prison key forged from her essence. Later, in Graduation Day, Angel is cured of a lethal poison with Buffy's blood. No spell, no medicine, no ritual could save him. Only the blood of the Slayer. Fans often point to these moments as proof that her Slayer blood isn't just tasty to vampires, it carries supernatural properties tied to her role as the Chosen One. But then you notice the inconsistencies. Vampires spend a lot of time bragging about how they'd love to taste Slayer blood, but in practice, not so much. From what we see, Spike only takes a bite when he kills the Chinese Slayer Jean Rong, and doesn't drink from Nikki Wood at all. Drusilla also murders Kendra without feeding. To be fair, she may have been in a rush to return to Angelus and end the world. Regardless, this has led to fan theories that Slayer blood isn't always desirable. Some argue that for veteran vampires, the kill itself is the prize. Drinking might even be risky, a distraction in a life or death fight, or as one Redditor put it, like cocaine, a massive high followed by an even worse crash. Other fans suggest it's more about status than flavour. Low-rent vampires brag about wanting Slayer blood to boost their street cred, but seasoned killers like Spike don't need to prove themselves by guzzling it. In that sense, the mystique of Slayer blood might be more cultural than chemical, a legend that inflates its supposed power. That said, there are plenty of theories that Slayer blood genuinely is different from normal human blood. One popular idea is that it's infused with the demonic essence planted by the Shadow Men in the first Slayer. Every Slayer inherits that spark, and it runs through their veins like concentrated dark energy. To a vampire, drinking it wouldn't just mean sustenance, it would be like tapping into pure power. There's also the question of permanence. Did the Master gain more than just a temporary boost when he tasted Buffy? Did Angel's transfusion grant him strength as well as healing? Some fans even speculate that Spike and Drusilla received a long-term power-up after feeding on Jean Rong in 1900. The show doesn't confirm it, but the possibility lingers in fan discussions. Could Slayer blood permanently enhance a vampire if they took enough? And then there are the odder theories. One thread jokes that Slayer blood might be an aphrodisiac, a sort of supernatural intoxicant, which would explain Drusilla's delighted reaction when she licked it from Spike's finger. If that's the case, we can all be glad the Master abruptly walked off screen. Others go further, wondering whether it could be weaponized. If it can break mystical barriers and cure poisons, could it also fuel spells or empower demons? I've seen commenters posit that maybe the Watchers Council had bottled it for their own experiments, and instances like when Faith was in a coma were perfect for this behaviour. Of course, these ideas were never established in the show, but that doesn't stop the Buffy fandom to endlessly build on their untapped potential, and I personally love it. Ultimately, the debate boils down to this: is Slayer blood genuinely unique, or is it just another example of the show's arguably inconsistent world building? For every canonical hint of its power, there's a scene that downplays it, but that ambiguity is exactly what keeps fans theorising. Maybe it really is the ultimate aphrodisiac, maybe it's a demonic energy drink, or maybe, as some argue, it's just another rumour in vampire communities that love to tell tall tales. Either way, the blood of the Slayer is a potent metaphor, her life force as both gift and burden. Whether it's breaking a mystical prison, saving a lover, or tempting a vampire, it's never just blood. And in true Buffy fashion, The mystery of it might be the point. Here's a question that admittedly is less common in the Buffy fandom, but one I have seen a few times and got me thinking. If the Slayer line has existed since early human civilization, is it possible that in the Buffyverse, some of the fiercest women in real-world history and mythology were Slayers? The reason this one interests me is because when I first became infatuated with the show in my teens, I would practically merge my knowledge of the real world with the established lore of the show. Any real historical facts were then considered in the context of the Buffyverse. So if someone mentioned a particular date in our real history regarding an important figure, a battle, war, monarchy related or any other significant event, my mind would race to imagine what the established characters were doing at that point and if they could have been involved. What was Angelus doing around the time of the Union of Ireland Act of 1800, which united the two kingdoms of Great Britain and Ireland? Was he still there in Ireland at this point? Or was this around the time of Angel's soul-burdened rat-eating phase? Okay, that one's easy. Angelus wasn't cursed until 1889, so he was definitely still evil. This thought process would apply to many of the other established characters. What were Spike, Drusilla or Darla doing during key moments in history? Yes, I'm aware that's pretty ridiculous, but here we are anyway. So, back to the topic. Could some of the fiercest warriors of our time been Slayers? Let's play with the idea. Buffy's world acknowledges a long, unbroken lineage of Slayers stretching back to the first Slayer. As we've already explored, a girl forcibly imbued with demonic essence by the Shadow Men. But apart from the occasional glimpse in the show, like Jean Rong or Nikki Wood, we barely see the identities of Slayers from the past. No detailed record. There isn't exactly a Slayer Hall of Fame. The comics and books have picked up the slack with the aforementioned Tales of the Slayer series, and dedicated Buffy fans have meticulously pieced together all mentions of Slayers into the Slayer timeline, which you can view online. But what if, from an in-universe lore perspective, the historical gaps in our Slayer timeline are hiding something bigger? What if the Slayer line, scattered across continents and centuries, had famous Slayers that the Watchers Council wanted kept hidden? The few fan posts I have discovered in my research have led to suggestions like Boudica, the Celtic queen who led a rebellion against the Roman Empire. Many cited Joan of Arc, a teenage warrior guided by visions and driven by a divine sense of purpose. Or the ancient Scythian women whose lifestyles generally enjoyed equality among the sexes, and some women took the opportunities that a warrior lifestyle offered to both men and women. The Amazons of ancient Greek legends were also suggested. In many of these examples, they were women who shattered the expectations of their time. Exactly the kind of figures you'd expect if the Slayer line had found its way into the history books. Some fans included mythological warriors that could fit the bill across ancient history if their stories were true. In Chinese legend, Mulan disguises herself to fight in place of her father. Driven not by power but duty, could the Slayer essence have manifested through these myths, echoing across cultures and stories of girls who fought, led and sacrificed? Could they have been slaying vampires in between battles, sharpening stakes when no one was looking? The Watchers Council might not have recognised or documented these women, or perhaps they did and buried the truth. After all, if the Slayer was ever too powerful, too revered, or too unpredictable, wouldn't the Council have preferred her legacy erased or rewritten? As we have established before, the Slayer's history is one of control, of being watched, managed, and shaped by a patriarchal institution. But these historical women warriors, they weren't watched, they weren't controlled. So I personally like to imagine the Slayer line isn't just a thread running through the Buffyverse, but was woven into our own history all along, because if the essence of the Slayer really is about protecting humanity from darkness, then maybe some Slayers never needed a Watcher to tell them what to do, they already knew. Could other vampire hunters exist in the Buffyverse? Buffy may be the Slayer, but she's hardly the only vampire hunter in fiction, which begs the question, could other legendary hunters from myth, literature and pop culture actually exist within the Buffyverse? It's not a far-fetched idea. In fact, the show already opened the door. Buffy vs. Dracula not only pulls Stoker's most famous creation into the canon, it plays him relatively straight. Well, as straight as you can when he's hypnotising Xander into being his manservant. He's ancient, arrogant, magically adept, and he clearly has a pre-existing reputation in the Buffyverse. The fact that he later turns up in the comics suggests he's not just a one-off stunt cameo, but an established part of the world. If Dracula exists, it's not a stretch to imagine that other vampire hunting legends might be lurking out there too. There's already a subtle nod in that direction. The Tales of the Slayer collection features a Slayer named Angelique Hawthorne, whose Watcher is Peter Van Helsing, heavily implied to be Abraham's brother. It's never outright stated, but it's the kind of wink and nudge lore expansion that rewards you for paying attention. If a Dracula and Van Helsing can exist in this world, then so can the rest of Stoker's cast. Mixing different fictions does raise questions though when it comes to the lore and the established conventions, as Dracula is very different from most other vampires in the Buffyverse. And of course, there are plenty great fan theories on other fictional universes which could work in Buffy, and some of these are really well thought out. I found one on Reddit which posits the idea that Buffy might not just share a universe with literary vampire hunters, but with Marvel superheroes. As the poster comments, according to Joss Whedon himself, he once considered slipping a throwaway line into a Marvel comic revealing that Scott Summers, Cyclops of the X-Men, had an insane cousin who believed she was a vampire slayer. The implication being that the Buffyverse is just one corner of the Marvel multiverse, and that Asylum Buffy from Normal Again in Season 6 wasn't delusional, but actually a mutant whose power allowed her to see alternate versions of herself. The demon attack in Normal Again? Just the catalyst that briefly synced her mind with her other self in Sunnydale. Of course, I like to flip it and imagine it's the Normal Again Buffy's wild imagination, similar to how she created the ideas of the Slayer and her friends in her head, that she also believes she has a cousin who is a member of the X-Men. This is obviously not canon, but now that Disney owns both, it's at least theoretically possible. The Marvel connection isn't even that much of a leap, because Buffy and Angel already have a history of crossovers. A few are explicit, like Dracula, others are more subtle. A name drop of Wayland Yutani here, which ties into Aliens, a fictional company from Buckaroo Banzai there, or direct lifts of characters like the Gorch brothers from the Wild Bunch. In one episode of Angel, you can even spot dwarvish text from the Lord of the Rings film sitting in Wesley's research pile, implying it's genuine occult material. I have to acknowledge the truly remarkable work fans have done in cataloguing every crossover nod and shared universe link. According to their research, Buffy and Angel's web of connections extends to Doctor Who, The X-Files, Evil Dead, Hellboy, Sherlock Holmes, James Bond, Predator, Ghostbusters, Conan the Barbarian, and more. Some are playful pop culture gags, others are real within the narrative. From there, the speculative door swings wide open. Could Captain Kronos, Hammer Films' swashbuckling vampire killer, have been active somewhere in 18th century Europe in the Buffyverse? Could the Watchers Council have quietly worked with other Slayer-adjacent hunters, sharing intel while keeping the Slayer line secret? We already know that monitoring the Slayer isn't their only function, and it would be easy to imagine they kept tabs on characters like Blade, a daywalker vampire human hybrid. Speaking of which, a meeting between Buffy and Blade would be quite interesting. I can already imagine the quips she would pull as he stands stoically, shades and leather coat billowing. Of course, the danger with crossovers is the temptation to make everything connected. Not every nod is proof of a shared reality. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, and sometimes the trio referring to their midi-chlorians is just a Star Wars joke. But given the show's existing canon, its literary borrowings and the sheer number of wink-to-camera references that turn out to be deliberate links, it's surprisingly easy to imagine a Buffyverse where other famous vampire hunters are out there, quietly doing their thing, while the Slayer holds the Hellmouth. Whether you consider the Marvel angle or imagine those literary nods as canon, it adds a fun layer to Buffy lore. The Slayer may be unique, but she's not necessarily alone. Somewhere out there in some dark alley, another hunter might be dusting vamps. And who knows, maybe one day some future season, comic or reboot will give us that meeting. Before wrapping up, as mentioned at the beginning, I want to circle back to something I really enjoy about making these videos, the discussion that comes afterwards. The comments section has turned into its own Slayer handbook, full of theories, corrections and headcanon that often enlighten or rival what's on screen. So before we close, let's look at some of the best ideas you've shared since the last video. Let's start with the first topic, the fan debate on the lore setup to have only one Slayer. One commenter suggested the first Slayer was never designed to be a global protector at all, just a local guardian, a regional champion bound to deal with a specific threat in a specific place. If that's true, the global legacy of the Slayer line wasn't mystical inevitability, but a bit of a fluke. A system that snowballed into doctrine. Without that accident, we might never have had a council, a Slayer line, or a show worth 7 seasons with spin-offs and comics. If we did, it would have just been about Buffy hanging out in LA. Others added that the Slayer is only one piece of the fight. The Watchers Council also had their own hunters, operatives and warlocks. Magic users, good aligned demons and council-backed fighters were all part of the tapestry, which suggests the Slayer was never meant to be the sole protagonist in the war against evil, just the most visible one to us. That ties neatly into another suggestion from you guys in the comments. Maybe the council was training potentials through a filtering system. Ones they deemed controllable were the potentials they prioritised, and so the thinking then is that the activated Slayers with no training would perish quicker, so one of their preferred candidates would likely be called. Given their history of manipulation, that feels less like a conspiracy theory and more like business as usual. We also had a correction to one of my examples last time. I used Jasmine's attempted world domination in Angel Season 4 as proof that the Council never had contingency plans for apocalypses outside of their Slayer's patch. A commenter rightly reminded me that by then the Council had already been wiped out by the first, since Buffy Season 7 runs parallel to Angel Season 4, so admittedly that was a bad example, but my argument still stands though. The Council logistically couldn't prepare or mobilise Slayers all the time for threats beyond whatever apocalypse happened to land in their backyard. And then came the resurrection debate. One commenter added an important wrinkle to the timeline. The first's earliest appearance in Season 3, masquerading as Jenny Calendar and others in Amends, happens before Buffy's second death, so maybe it wasn't her resurrection that caused the first to rise, but the first time she was revived in Prophecy Girl. The Season 6 revival might have just made things worse, or as I mentioned in my previous video, that's how the first had the power to tap into the Slayer line and identify where potentials were located. Either way, cheating death clearly scrambles the rules of the Slayer line. However, another commenter proposed something fascinating. Buffy's magical resurrection in Season 6 didn't just revive her, it screwed up the whole metaphysical works. To quote their theory on why the first starts killing potentials in Season 7 is that Buffy's resurrection with magic prevented new potentials being born and from becoming candidates for activation at the right age. The magic of the Slayer had to re-inhabit a corpse which had long since lost its powers. As long as Buffy lives, the Slayer magic is being used up to maintain her powers. So that's why the first evil struck when it did. It knew the list of potentials was static. The plan wasn't to kill Buffy at first, it was to let her live, just long enough for the magical connection to go extinct, according to this theory, of course. And that's why, as they pointed out, Buffy was explicitly spared by both the Turok-Han and Caleb, not because she was too powerful to kill, but because her death would undo the plan. Another commenter built on this, suggesting Willow's spell in Chosen might have done more than just activate the current crop of potentials. It may have broken the magical bottleneck entirely, a spiritual hard reset. That opens the door to all kinds of implications, especially if we imagine the Slayer magic as a finite force, recycled and repurposed over generations. As discussed earlier in the video, there are fan theories that the first Slayer, Sinea, was always the most powerful throughout the entire legacy because she was the one merged with the demon spirit and thus had the most concentrated dose of its powers and likely primal temperament. Throughout the Slayer line, the theory is that with each transference to another Slayer, the power has become slightly diluted with every fresh activation, which also backs up the argument made earlier that it was weak enough from having to re-establish Buffy as an active Slayer that it couldn't magically generate new potentials. A few of you raised another wrinkle. Buffy may have grown stronger each time she returned. After her first death in Season 1, she defeated the Master with ease, where minutes earlier he had overwhelmed and defeated her. After her Season 6 resurrection, she worried that she came back wrong, but maybe she actually came back upgraded. One fan compared it to people reporting strange abilities after near-death experiences. According to the theory in the comments, in Buffy's case, it may have been an extra edge that made her capable of standing toe-to-toe with gods and primordial forces, alongside her having friends and being a resourceful Slayer in general. Finally, a few of you pushed the conversation further. One theory framed Buffy's resurrection as an upset in the natural order, tipping the cosmic balance of good and evil. Too much weight on the side of good meant evil had to surge in response, giving the first its foothold. Others suggested the first needed 3 rare but very specific conditions to act: a resurrected Slayer, a vampire with a soul, and love between the two. Which, let's face it, is staggeringly what happens twice in the show. Poor Buffy's love life ruining things for us all again. At that, I think, is the perfect note to close on. The richness of these discussions comes from all of you. The fact that the lore is messy, contradictory and unfinished is what makes it worth debating. So if you've got a theory that wasn't covered here or you disagree entirely with what I've just said, drop it below, because clearly we're not done with this lore yet, not even close. However, we will take a break from the lore of the Slayer and will return another time. For my next video, I will be focusing on a different topic in the Buffyverse. As always, thanks for watching and see you in the next video.